Action.
So 3rd June every year is popularly known as the Uganda Martyrs Day. And one of the words that keep being re-echoed is the word Namugongo. And that's where the two places where you see the Anglicans and Roman Catholics gathering, two different sites in a place called Namugongo. But why 3rd June? And I'm going to take us on a brief journey. Why 3rd June and why Namugongo? So in the year 1877, we had the first church mission society missionaries from England, sent by Church of England, arrive here in Uganda. By then, Uganda is one of those old kingdoms in this region. And Uganda was very, very organized. It had a leadership headed by the king, who is called the Kabaka. So when Reverend City Wilson, Lieutenant Shagod Smith arrived in this region, they decided to settle in the king's palace. And the king gave them a very, very good welcome, the Kabaka. And later on they were joined by Alexander Mackay, who later on largely is called Mackay here in Uganda, and in the number of references within the Church of Uganda and Uganda in general. And so when the missionaries arrived here, those three and the rest later on, consequently, more different missionaries joined in. Part of the place they started from was sharing this faith, teaching literacy to the pages in the kingdom, to the servants, to the young men that were serving the Kabaka in the palace, and those that were close to the palace. So you find that there was a big accumulation of missionaries around the king's courts, around the king's palace, the Kabaka. So for instance, Alexander Mackay had his base in Natete, which is not far from the palace also. So a number of young men that were serving in the king's palace found attraction to this newfound faith. The stories about Jesus actually were very amazing. Actually, a number of them began to be baptized. A number of them enrolled to be catechumen. A number of them began to be taught this Christian faith. And so their allegiance went now more to their newfound faith in Jesus Christ. And so as the years went by, the king discovered the allegiance of these young men is no longer totally to me. Because for you to appreciate where this was coming from, the king, the Kabaka, was sort of like revered as a god, or in a way. He had that position. He was not God, but sort of like they was taken. So he had this big allegiance, and all of a sudden, the young men who were going to the missionaries, the young men who were taking on this Christian faith, seemed not to be having that same allegiance. So that did not rub well with the Kabaka then, called Manga, who was actually a very young king, So what happens in the year 1885? We see three young men. One was called Mako Kakumba, the other one was called Seranga. Three of them were actually burnt alive in a place in Kampala, in Lubaga division, called Busega. That particular place was called Mpimerera. And so these three young men in January 1885 were actually burnt alive in that place. Actually, that place is still existed. There is a church there called Martyrs Church, Busega. So when you go there, you're able to trace that place, that spot where those three young men were killed. They were the first. And the idea was that the others would get scared, that the others would now quit this faith. But listen to me, that was not the case. These young men continued, in their newfound faith. And the king began to be enraged here and there. Their allegiance seemed to be shifting to Jesus more than to the king. So what happens as we enter the year 1886, on a particular day, on May 25th, in a place called Munyonyo, Mulungu, by the shores of Lake Victoria. One time the king comes from his hunting expedition, and the king had not it had failed. He had failed to get any wild game. So out of rage, he looks for one of his beloved servants called Musa Mukasa. And Musa Mukasa was nowhere to be seen. Musa Mukasa had gone to meet with the missionaries, had gone to share faith. And so as Musa Mukasa returns, the king asks, where have you been? And out of rage, finding out that he had been with the missionaries, he asked him to renounce the faith. Musa Mukasa refuses to renounce the faith. So what happens? He is actually killed there at that spot in Murungu, in Munyonyo. So he becomes the fourth to be martyred in this row of these young converts. And the idea was that the rest are scared. But what happened now? The young men who had embraced Jesus actually got more zealous about Jesus. So now the next 1 week, the king had to issue a decree. You have to decide. You are either for the king or you are for Jesus. And guess what? A number of young men chose to live with Jesus. And so the king had his court in a place called Munyonyo in Kampala by the shores of Lake Victoria. And the king called them on the eve of 3rd June 1886, and asked them to denounce Jesus. But guess what? To the dismay of the king, a number of them chose to move with Jesus. And so he told them, I am going to burn you alive. And so there is a place with the current Namugongo was the execution center. It was a prison, but also a place where those that were disobedient to the king would be taken and they would be murdered there, they would be killed there, So he told them, I am going to take you to Namugongo. And, to scare them, but still a number of them chose to move with Jesus. So that fateful day, the verdict is passed. Whoever chooses Jesus, you're going to head to Namugongo. So they were tied right from Munyonyo. Munyonyo is by the shores of Lake Victoria. And they were moved, beaten, all sorts of torture were happening along the way. Actually, a number of them died on the way. We have quite a number who died in the area of Munyonyo, where you have the current Roman Catholic shrine and the surrounding area, the likes of Anderia Kagwa, Posiano Ngondwe. They died in those areas of Munyonyo. Then they moved through the current Kampala city center, and still more kept dying. The likes of Valikudembe, dying in the city center, moving upwards, in the area of what we have as old Kampala. We have Matia Murumba, who was one of the oldest, dying, being killed at that spot. So the trek continued. This is over a 30-kilometer stretch from Munyonyo to Namugongo. And they moved through the present day Ntinda, into Najera areas, into Nadia. Those are the current places. Into Nadia, Chadi Wajara. Then they reach a place called Bulori, where one of the leaders of the team, by the names of Charles Rwanga, popularly known as Karoli Rwanga, for him is killed there, where we have the current Roman Catholic shrine. Then the rest, 25 in total, actually more, 25 plus, were taken now to the real execution center in Namugongo, where we have the present Anglican shrine, And while there, the issue was that actually they are tortured to renounce their faith. So what was the deal? The deal was simple. The executioner called Mukaddeayiga told these young boys, each of you should go and look for wood, because there was a forest in that place. Bring the wood that we shall use to burn you. And the idea was that they would renounce the faith. They would just make up their minds and run away. But guess what? To the dismay of the executioner Mukaddeayiga and the rest, actually these young men went and actually fetched wood that was to be used to burn them. And so the furnace was lit. Each one was tied around pieces of wood, and slowly the fire was lit, starting from the feet. And the idea was that as they feel that heat, some are able to renounce the faith. But guess what? Instead of renouncing the faith, these young men died singing. They sang a popular Luganda hymn, Bulijjo tutendereza ekibuga kyaffe, that daily we have been singing, daily we've been praising and looking forward to this new heavenly city. So ideally, that means they must have seen heaven open even as they were going through all this troubling time. And so at the end of the day, they died singing, they died rejoicing in the Lord Jesus Christ, and they died with this confidence that actually heaven is receiving them. But as that was happening, the king sends word for two of them to be released, because he felt these were very, very key in his executions. One of them was called Eliakaji, another one was called Hamukasa, and these two actually were released, but they did deny their faith. But on the king's orders, they were released. And actually, most of the story that we have is told by these two. Actually, Hamukasa later on becomes the chief of Chaplain, where, like this and where Uganda Christian University is located. He was one of the owners, you know. So he was the chief. He became a chief later on. So that's the story we have about these young men. And so the king thought, by killing, there were 25 in number who were killed at Namugongo, 12 Roman Catholics, 13 Anglicans. They were killed singing together, and the idea was to stop this faith. But guess what? When the testimony of what happened came out, instead the gospel began to spread. The church, the young church that was barely 10 years old, got more zeal. The real Baganda, you know, native converts began now to move out with this gospel. A number of them later on would now move to even the neighboring areas, sort of like we have the church planted in present-day Eastern Congo. It was planted by a Ugandan convert known as Apollo Chivebula. Now, later on, there was fruit. The mission movement now shifted from purely CMS missionaries from England to even now local young converts who now decided to traverse, you know, the neighboring areas of Uganda, which now currently is the present-day Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, and Eastern Congo. So a number of them now moved, charged in with this faith. They were now willing to lose everything. A man like Apollo Chivebula was willing to lose his prestigious positions here and move to the Ituri forests and move to evangelize amongst the pygmies.